Ralph here. Welcome back to the RHCSA tip of the week. This week in this tip, we're going to talk about the auto mounter service and Autofs. This is, well, one of the things, let me just say this. One of the things that I really like about Red Hat and the way they lay out their certification program is they give you very, very clear objectives. And on those objectives, you have a clear list of everything and all the tasks and competencies that you have to have before you sit down and take the exam. I guess one glaring exception to that would be Autofs and the auto mounter. If you go out and pick up a book about studying for the RHCSA, or you visit a website, or you do a little bit of research, you'll see that the auto mounter is given significant amount of attention in any of those resources, and there's definitely a reason for that. So why don't we go ahead and get started. So first off, whenever I start these tips, I almost always start by, having us go out and take a look here at the objectives and kind of explicitly talk about, what objective we're mapping to and with the particular topic that we are covering. But in this particular case, if I search the objectives on auto, for example, I'll see some references to particular items, but start and stop services, configure services automatically. If I search on mount, for example, there will be references to the need for us to be able to mount file systems and that sort of thing. But there's really no specific reference to Autofs as a service or the auto mounter. So in this particular case, we're going to look at something that may not be explicitly stated in the objectives, but is definitely a competency and a skill that you're going to want to bring into the exam environment. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So let's go ahead and get on our system. All right, in this particular case, we're going to work with client 0. And let's go ahead and get that full screen. Let me go ahead and get logged in here. All right, so the actual service that we're looking at here is going to be Autofs. So if I do an RPM -Q for Autofs, we'll see that the package is not installed. So let's take care of business first. So I'm going to do a sudo yum -y install Autofs. So this should install the Autofs service. Get my password entered in here. All right, so the service is installed. Now, there's a few files that we're going to look at, and I'm going to go through the configuration here for Autofs. If I do an ls on etc AutoStar, just to kind of get us started here, you'll see here that we have a configuration file for the service, autofs.conf, and then we have the Autofs Master, and there's a couple other files there, the auto.mis, and some LDAP authentication piece. So I'm going to get out to root here. The first thing we're going to look at, just quickly take a look at the configuration file. So I'm going to open up the etc autofs.conf file. Not a whole lot that I want to point to here, but let's kind of back up a little bit and talk about what the auto mounter service does. The auto mounter service allows us to create dynamic mounts. Okay, normally when we define a mount point, a persistent mount, we would define that in the FS tab file, right? Whether it be a local file system or an NFS share or whatever it may be. But in order to minimize, for example, the number of NFS shares that I might have to define in my FS tab file, I can use the auto mounter service in order to dynamically mount those. And so that when I access them, they're mounted, and then over a period of time, they will be dismounted so the system doesn't have to maintain those mounts. And so you'll see here that the timeout value here is set to 300 seconds. Okay, so when we dynamically mount a file system, and we'll get to that point where we actually show you how to do that, it will maintain that mount for a total of 300 seconds. Okay? The default is 10 minutes. Obviously, that would be 600 seconds, but in this case, the system is set to 300 seconds. And that's really about the only thing that I really wanted to point to and have us take a look at here in the actual configuration file. Now, so I'm going to go ahead and get out of that file. There were some other files that we looked at, right? Oops. So let's say ls etc auto star. And the primary configuration file is the Autofs Master. So let's start there. So I'm going to open up the etc Autofs Master. There's some pretty cool stuff that AutoFS sort of does out of the box once I get this service started. So one thing we have here is the miscellaneous. So the root mist directory and the contents of that is going to be an etc auto.mist. We'll take a quick look at that in a second. And then the /net or the root net directory is going to automatically allow you to dynamically browse out to NFS shares and mount them automatically. And then also it will include, files with a Autofs extension in the etc Autofs Master.d directory, and we'll also take a look at using that in a minute. But let's just see Autofs no configuration out of the box. So I'm going to go ahead and quit here, and I am going to start the service. So we'll say systemctl start Autofs. Another thing I'm going to do here, everything you do has to be persistent, and so let's make that persistent. So I'm going to go ahead and enable the service. So systemctl enable Autofs, so it'll automatically start at boot. Okay, so the service should be running. Anytime you start a service, it's good practice to go out and check the status of said service, and it shows me as being active and running. All right, now remember we had that net directory. If I do a listing of root net, it doesn't show me any files. But if I say ls and do a listing of root net for, let's say, srv0, then all of a sudden it shows me all of the mount points for srv0. Again, if I do a show mount to view the NFS mounts of that resource, srv0, you'll see that it is exporting 3 directories. Enterprise Linux 1, Enterprise Linux 2, Enterprise Linux 3. Now, I haven't defined in my FS tab file to mount those, but now that I have AutoFS running, I can actually access those directories and it will dynamically mount them. So if I say ls net srv0, and then let's just say ent linux 1, shows me the contents. If I do a df command now, you'll see that it dynamically mounted that file system. So that's cool. I mean, you got access to all of the NFS mounts in your environment just by installing Autofs and starting the service. I haven't done anything except taking the out-of-the-box configuration, and now I can just dynamically access any of the NFS mounts that I have in my environment. So just out of the box, I mean, to me, that's a very, very cool thing as an instructor, and I've got lots of students, and being able to check in on their work and that type of thing without having to go through a mount, very cool. Okay, so that's just straight out of the box, and it'll maintain that mount to srv0 as long as I use it, and then eventually it'll go through the timeout and it'll dismount it. So I like that. Okay, I think that's a neat thing. Now, let's say, for example, that I wanted to mount that Enterprise Linux 1 directory over there on srv0 through my miscellaneous directory. So remember that there was another configuration file, and that was etc auto.misc, miscellaneous. And so here's the contents of that. And really the auto mounter goes back to sort of this way for non-root users. If you go back in the history, non-root users being able to mount, removable media. So you'll see right there, the only thing that's not commented out here is the CD. But if I wanted to create what we call an indirect mount to that server's export, then I could add a line here. And so I would say, and I can just, I'll call it whatever I want. I'll call it data. And then I would specify my mount options, right? So if I wanted to mount it, read only, or read write, or whatever it may be. Let's say I'm gonna do a read only mount. So I'll do RO. These are my mount options, and then here's where I define the resource. In this case, SRV0. This is NFS, so I'll use the colon, and then Enterprise Linux 1. Now go ahead and save my change. Now there was always a bug with Autofs that it didn't like to restart correctly, and so I've always gotten in this habit of stopping the service and then restarting the service. I don't think you really actually need to do that anymore, but as a habit, from back when there was a known issue there, that was the workaround. But a restart probably would work fine. So now if I do an ls on my miscellaneous data directory, you'll see there's the contents of that export. Okay. And again, if we look at our mounts, you'll see that SRV0. But again, it's a dynamic mount. It doesn't mount it until I access that particular directory. All right, so that's sort of the basics. Okay, now let's take a look at a little bit more complex example. Now I've configured this system for LDAP authentication. If you haven't worked with that before, I do have a video out there to go through that particular process. But you'll see here that I can change to a LDAP user. Okay, so if I say switch users to, let's say, LDAP 1, you'll see that my prompt changes there, and my UID is going to change, but I get a warning error as well. Okay, so I have this message here, warning, cannot change the directory home LDAP 1, no such file or directory. Okay. And so if I, as that user, okay, so if I say, who am I? I'm LDAP 1. Okay. If I run the ID command, okay, I'm this LDAP 1 UID 2001 user. Okay. And if I echo, $home, you'll see that it's looking for my home directory in home LDAP 1. Now I'm going to exit out of that user account, and what we'll see if we list the contents of home, that there's no LDAP directory there. So there obviously is no LDAP 1 directory. Now the truth is these LDAP user directories are actually stored out on a different resource. If I again use my net directory, so if I change directories to net, but then go to resource, and I do a listing, so again, this is the NFS. I dynamically mounted it, right? Whoops. Well, I haven't accessed it, so it hasn't quite dynamically mounted it yet. It's just showing me the contents. And there's the home directory. So if I change directories into home, and then I do a listing, there's the LDAP directory. And if I change directories into LDAP, and then again do another listing, there's where all my LDAP users' home directories are. Okay, so what I want to happen now is that when I switch over to a LDAP user, it's going to want to access the home LDAP and then the username home directory, and I want Autofs to handle that in a dynamic way. All right, so the directories are there, but right now they're not mounted, and so I get that error when I switch over to the user. But we're going to fix that. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a little placeholder for those, a mount point for those directories. So I'll make a directory called home LDAP. All right, so that worked okay. And I'm just going to go back to my root here. So I have a directory called home LDAP. Now, remember in the auto.master file, we had this include statement. It's going to add the contents of the dir etc auto.master.d. Okay, and I'm going to use that instead of making my changes here directly in the auto.master. I'm going to keep the configuration file clean here, and I'm going to create a file. Okay. And the file that I'm going to create is in etc, and then auto.master.d. And remember, it has to have the Autofs extension, so I'm just going to call it, let's call it home.autofs. Okay, so we're going to create a file in the auto.master.d with a .autofs extension here, and I'm just going to call it home.autofs. All right, so the contents of this file are going to be pretty straightforward. So in this file, we're just going to define our directory. This is and our directory is, let's spell it correctly. So this is going to be home, and then home LDAP, that's our directory. And then the file where we're going to define the actual mount here is a new file that we're going to create here, and we're just going to call it auto.home. So in etc, we're going to create a file called auto.home, and that's it. All right. Now, we need to create the auto.home file. Now, interestingly here, this is going to really follow in that same syntax as the auto.miss and things like that. But one of the things that you can do, okay, is that when you're creating these files, you can use wildcards, because I don't have just one LDAP user. I got LDAP 0 all the way to LDAP 54. Okay, so instead of defining a particular directory here in this indirect mount, I'm going to use wildcards, and let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to use star, okay, for the directory name, okay, and then if I wanted to include mount options, your read writes, your read only, you could here. Or you can just define the resource. So in this particular case, our mount point is going to be out on resource. So resource.nhls.com. And then the directory that we're going to mount is the home LDAP. And then I'm going to use an ampersand. Okay. So ampersand in when you define the resource, and star to define that you're going to mount all these different user directories. All right, now if I did everything correctly here, and again, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to restart the service. So system control stop, autofs, and then let's do a start, and then anytime you start and stop a service, get yourself in the habit of checking the status. Make sure that everything restarted correctly. Everything appears to be correct. Now remember, the last time that I changed to an LDAP user, I got that error message about not being able to find the directory. So let's try it this time. So I'll SU out to LDAP 3, no error message, right? If I print my working directory, I'm in home LDAP 3. Everything looks good. If I do a DF, look at that. Auto mounted the directory for the user. Awesome. I really like the auto mounter service. I mean, out of the box, it does some really cool things in terms of being able to access, NFS shares without having to mount them. But there are a number of different ways that you may run into or may be required to use AutoFS as part of the exam environment. So hopefully that gives you an idea about how to get it done. I'm going to go ahead and exit out here. And let me come over here. So, I try to keep these as short as possible, but, AutoFS is a valuable competency and skill from an RHCSA exam standpoint. Also, you may find areas in your environment where it will also be a a very beneficial thing. So I hope that tip helped, and go ahead and give me a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you like my videos, and we'll see everybody later.